The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground at Fort Braxton as hundreds of soldiers assembled for the annual award ceremony. Among them stood Captain Sarah Mitchell, her dress uniform perfectly pressed, medals gleaming on her chest. She had earned every single one through years of dedication, sacrifice, and exceptional service that had taken her from the dusty streets of Afghanistan to classified operations that would never make headlines. Sarah kept her eyes forward as the ceremony began, but she could feel the familiar weight of skeptical glances from some of her male colleagues. Even after 15 years in the military, she still encountered those who questioned whether a woman belonged in their ranks, especially one who had risen through the ranks as quickly as she had. Today felt different though. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. The base commander, Colonel Harrison, approached the podium with a sealed envelope in his hand. His withered face bore the marks of decades of military service, and, when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had seen combat in 3 different conflicts. Today, we gather not just to honor our finest soldiers, but to recognize extraordinary service that goes beyond the call of duty, he announced to the assembled troops. Sarah's mind wandered to her childhood in a small town in Ohio, where her father had run a struggling auto repair shop and her mother worked double shifts at the local diner. Military service had been her ticket out, her chance to prove that she was more than the circumstances of her birth. She remembered the day she had first put on the uniform, how proud her parents had looked despite their concerns about their daughter choosing such a dangerous path. The early years had been brutal. Boot camp instructors who seemed determined to break her spirit, fellow recruits who saw her as either a weakness or a threat, and the constant pressure to prove that she belonged. But Sarah had persevered, driven by an inner fire that refused to be extinguished. She excelled in every training program, mastered weapons systems that many men struggled with, and demonstrated leadership qualities that her superiors couldn't ignore. Her first deployment to Iraq had been a baptism by fire. As a young lieutenant, she had led a convoy through some of the most dangerous territory in the country, bringing supplies to forward operating bases where soldiers had been cut off from support for weeks. The mission had gone sideways when insurgents ambushed her convoy on a narrow mountain road. Under heavy fire, with 2 of her soldiers wounded and their vehicles damaged, Sarah had made a split-second decision that saved their lives. Instead of following standard protocol to wait for backup, she had ordered her team to abandon the vehicles and scale the rocky hillside, carrying their wounded comrades to safety. For 6 hours, they had evaded enemy patrols, with Sarah using her knowledge of guerrilla tactics to keep them hidden until rescue arrived. The medal she received for that action was just the beginning of a distinguished career that would take her to the most dangerous corners of the world. Years later, during a classified mission in Afghanistan, Sarah had been tasked with leading a joint operation between American forces and local allies. The mission required not just military expertise but diplomatic skills, as tensions between the different groups threatened to derail the entire operation. Sarah had spent weeks building trust with the Afghan commanders, learning their customs, and proving that she respected their culture while still maintaining American objectives. When the operation launched, it had been Sarah's quick thinking that prevented it from becoming a disaster. Intelligence reports had been wrong about enemy positions, and her team found themselves surrounded by Taliban fighters in a remote valley. With communications down and no hope of immediate backup, Sarah had managed to coordinate a fighting retreat that brought all of her soldiers home alive. The successful completion of that mission had earned her a promotion and recognition from the highest levels of military command. But success came with a price. Sarah had missed family gatherings, holidays, and important milestones in the lives of people she cared about. Relationships had failed under the strain of her military commitment, and she had learned to find fulfillment in service rather than personal connections. The soldiers under her command became her family, and their safety became her primary concern. As Colonel Harrison continued his remarks, Sarah noticed Major Bradley Peterson standing near the front of the formation. Peterson was known throughout the base for his old-school attitudes about women in combat roles. He had never directly confronted Sarah, but his disapproval was evident in every interaction they had. She had heard through unofficial channels that he had questioned her rapid promotion, suggesting that political correctness rather than merit had advanced her career. Peterson represented everything that Sarah had fought against throughout her military service. He was the type of officer who believed that physical strength was the only qualification that mattered in combat, ignoring the reality that modern warfare required intelligence, adaptability, and leadership skills that had nothing to do with gender. His presence at today's ceremony felt ominous, though Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on why. The ceremony continued with the presentation of various awards and commendations. Sarah watched as young soldiers received recognition for their service, remembering her own early days when such ceremonies had seemed like distant goals. Now, as a senior officer, she took pride in seeing the next generation of military leaders being recognized for their dedication and sacrifice. Colonel Harrison's voice cut through her thoughts as he began speaking about the day's most significant award. The Distinguished Service Cross is our nation's second-highest military decoration, awarded for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, he announced solemnly. Today, we have the honor of presenting this medal to an officer whose actions saved not just American lives, but strengthened our alliances and advanced our strategic objectives in one of the most challenging theaters of operation. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. She had been told that she would receive an award today, but the specific nature of that award had been kept confidential. The Distinguished Service Cross was an honor that few soldiers ever received, and even fewer women had been recognized with such a prestigious decoration. As Colonel Harrison continued reading the citation, Sarah's mind raced through the events that had led to this moment. The classified mission that he was describing, though he couldn't mention specific details in a public forum, had been the culmination of months of planning and preparation. It had required her to work with international partners, navigate complex political situations, and ultimately lead a high-risk operation that had strategic implications far beyond the immediate military objectives. The mission had taken place in a region where American forces were working to stabilize local government while combating insurgent activities. Sarah had been chosen to lead the operation because of her unique combination of combat experience, language skills, and diplomatic training. The success of the mission had not only achieved its immediate goals but had also strengthened relationships with ally forces that would prove crucial in future operations. But the real test had come when the mission had gone wrong. Enemy forces had obtained intelligence about American plans, and Sarah's team had walked into what was essentially a trap. Outnumbered and outgunned, with civilian lives hanging in the balance, Sarah had made a series of tactical decisions that had turned a potential disaster into a strategic victory. The details of those decisions remained classified, but the results spoke for themselves. Not only had her team completed their primary objectives, but they had also gathered intelligence that led to the disruption of a major terrorist network. The operation had been studied at military academies as an example of innovative leadership under extreme pressure. As these memories flooded back, Sarah became aware that Colonel Harrison had called her name. The hundreds of soldiers in formation turned their attention toward her as she stepped forward, her heart pounding with a mixture of pride and humility. This was the moment she had worked toward her entire career, recognition from the highest levels of military command for service that had truly made a difference. But, as she approached the podium, she noticed Major Peterson's expression had darkened considerably. His jaw was clenched, and his hands were balled into fists at his sides. The sight sent a chill down Sarah's spine, though she couldn't understand why his reaction was so intense. This was supposed to be a moment of celebration, not confrontation. Colonel Harrison smiled as Sarah reached the podium, and she could see genuine pride in his eyes. He had been her mentor during some of the most challenging periods of her career, and his support had been instrumental in her advancement. "Captain Mitchell," he said in a voice that carried across the entire parade ground, "your service exemplifies the highest traditions of our military, and your leadership under fire has brought honor to your unit, your service branch, and your nation." As the colonel prepared to present the medal, Sarah caught sight of Major Peterson moving through the formation. His movement seemed purposeful, almost predatory, and she felt a growing sense of unease. The ceremony should have been a moment of pure triumph, but something in Peterson's demeanor suggested that the day's events were far from over. The Distinguished Service Cross felt heavy in Colonel Harrison's hands as he prepared to pin it to Sarah's uniform. This medal represented more than personal achievement, it was recognition of the sacrifices made by all military personnel who put their lives on the line in service to their country. For Sarah, it was validation that her years of dedication had not gone unnoticed by those who mattered most. But, even as she prepared to accept this highest honor, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Major Peterson's presence represented a storm cloud on what should have been the brightest day of her military career. The ceremony was about to take a turn that none of them could have anticipated, and the true test of Sarah's character was yet to come. The moment Colonel Harrison lifted the Distinguished Service Cross towards Sarah's uniform, Major Peterson broke from his position in the formation. His movement was sudden and aggressive, cutting through the perfectly aligned ranks of soldiers like a predator stalking its prey. The sound of his boots on the concrete echoed across the silent parade ground as hundreds of eyes tracked his unexpected approach to the podium. "Sir, I must object to this proceeding," Peterson's voice boomed across the ceremony, his words sharp and challenging. The assembled soldiers shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what they were witnessing. Military ceremonies were sacred traditions, governed by strict protocol, and Peterson's interruption violated every principle of military decorum. Colonel Harrison's hand froze in mid-air, the medal suspended between honor and controversy. His face darkened with controlled anger as he turned toward the interrupting officer. "Major Peterson, you will return to your position immediately," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military leadership. But Peterson was beyond the reach of normal military discipline. His face was flushed with anger, veins visible on his neck as he continued his advance toward Sarah. "This woman does not deserve to stand among real soldiers," he declared, his voice growing louder with each word. "She has used her gender to advance through the ranks while better qualified men have been passed over for promotion." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as Peterson's accusations echoed across the parade ground. She had faced discrimination before, but never so publicly, never during what should have been the proudest moment of her career. The weight of hundreds of stares pressed down upon her as she struggled to maintain her military bearing in the face of such an unprecedented attack. Peterson's rant continued, his words becoming more vicious with each passing second. "I have served this country for 20 years, and I have watched political correctness destroy the integrity of our military," he shouted, now close enough to the podium that Sarah could see the hatred burning in his eyes. "This medal should go to a real soldier, not some diversity hire who has been promoted beyond her capabilities." The silence that followed Peterson's words was deafening. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, as if nature itself was holding its breath to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as she faced the most public humiliation of her career. Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Major Peterson, you are out of line and will face court-martial for this breach of conduct," he warned, but Peterson seemed to have passed the point of rational thought. The anger that had been building in him for years had finally found an outlet, and he was determined to make his stand regardless of the consequences. "I will not stand by and watch our military become a social experiment," Peterson continued, his finger now pointing directly at Sarah. "Women like her have no business in combat roles, and certainly no business receiving medals that should be reserved for real warriors who have earned them through blood and sacrifice." Sarah's military training kicked in, overriding the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm her. She had faced enemy fire in 3 different countries, had made life-and-death decisions under pressure that most people could never imagine, and she would not allow one bitter officer to diminish her achievements. She stepped forward, meeting Peterson's gaze directly. "Major Peterson," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the parade ground, "I have served alongside brave men and women in some of the most dangerous places on earth. My record speaks for itself, and I will not allow your prejudice to overshadow the sacrifices made by every soldier in this formation." Peterson's reaction to Sarah's words was explosive. The careful facade of military professionalism that he had maintained throughout his career finally cracked completely. "You think you're better than us because you've slept your way to the top," he snarled, taking another step closer to Sarah in a manner that was clearly threatening. The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. In all her years of military service, through all the challenges and discrimination she had faced, no one had ever dared to make such a vile suggestion about her character. The implication that her achievements were the result of sexual favors rather than merit and sacrifice was the ultimate insult to everything she had worked for. But, before Sarah could respond to Peterson's attack, something unexpected happened. A voice from the back of the formation called out, "That's enough." It was Sergeant Williams, a decorated combat veteran who had served under Sarah's command during their deployment to Afghanistan. His interruption violated military protocol, but his loyalty to his former commander had overcome his training. Williams's outburst seemed to break a spell that had frozen the other soldiers in place. Murmurs began to ripple through the formation as other veterans of Sarah's commands began to shift restlessly. These were soldiers who had witnessed her leadership firsthand, who had seen her courage under fire, and who knew the truth about her character in ways that no amount of prejudice could diminish. Major Peterson sensed the changing mood among the assembled troops, and his anger intensified. He had expected his words to find support among the soldiers, particularly the older veterans who he assumed shared his traditional views about women in combat. Instead, he was discovering that Sarah's reputation among the troops was far different from what he had imagined. "You've all been brainwashed by political correctness," Peterson shouted, his voice now reaching a pitch that bordered on hysteria. "Can't you see what's happening to our military? We're being weakened from within by people who have no business wearing the uniform." The situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his own anger now barely contained as he prepared to physically intervene if necessary. But Peterson's next action shocked everyone present, crossing a line that no one had anticipated. In a moment of complete loss of control, Peterson reached out and grabbed Sarah's arm, his grip tight enough to leave marks. "I won't let you destroy everything this uniform stands for," he growled, his face inches from hers. The physical contact was assault, a criminal act that transformed the situation from a disciplinary matter into something far more serious. Sarah's training in hand-to-hand combat kicked in instinctively. She had been taught to defend herself against enemy attackers, and Peterson's aggressive action triggered responses that had been drilled into her through years of military training. But she also knew that any physical retaliation against a fellow officer, regardless of the justification, could end her career. The tension reached a breaking point as Peterson's grip tightened on Sarah's arm. The assembled soldiers watched in horror as their ceremony descended into something that resembled a street fight more than a military proceeding. Some of the younger enlisted personnel began to move forward, their protective instincts overriding their training to remain in formation. Colonel Harrison's voice boomed across the parade ground with an authority that stopped everyone in their tracks. "Major Peterson, release Captain Mitchell immediately or face immediate arrest," he commanded, his hand moving toward his sidearm in a gesture that left no doubt about his willingness to use force if necessary. But Peterson was beyond reason. The years of resentment and anger that had built up inside him had found their focus in Sarah, and he seemed determined to make his stand regardless of the consequences. "She doesn't belong here," he repeated, his grip on her arm becoming even more painful. "None of them belong here." The situation had reached a dangerous tipping point. Military discipline was crumbling in real time as hundreds of soldiers watched their superiors engage in what amounted to a public brawl. The ceremony that was supposed to celebrate military excellence had become a demonstration of everything that could go wrong when prejudice and anger overcame training and professionalism. Sarah looked into Peterson's eyes and saw something that frightened her more than any enemy she had ever faced. This was hatred in its purest form, untempered by reason or restraint. She realized that Peterson's attack was not just about her personally, but about everything she represented to him. In his mind, she was the symbol of changes in the military that threatened his sense of identity and purpose. The physical pain of Peterson's grip was nothing compared to the emotional impact of his words. Sarah had dedicated her life to serving her country, had sacrificed personal relationships and comfort for the privilege of wearing the uniform. To have her service questioned and her character attacked in such a public forum was devastating in ways that no amount of military training could have prepared her for. But even as Peterson continued his verbal and physical assault, Sarah could see something changing in the crowd of assembled soldiers. The initial shock was giving way to anger, not directed at her, but at Peterson himself. These were professional soldiers who understood the value of discipline and respect, and Peterson's behavior violated everything they had been taught to hold sacred. The ceremony that had begun as a celebration of military excellence was transforming into a defining moment that would test the character of everyone present. As Peterson maintained his grip on Sarah's arm and continued his hateful rant, the stage was set for a revelation that would change everything the assembled soldiers thought they knew about their military hierarchy. The tension on the parade ground had reached a breaking point when Colonel Harrison stepped forward with an expression that none of the assembled soldiers had ever seen before. His weathered face carried a mixture of authority and something else, something that suggested he possessed knowledge that would fundamentally change the nature of the confrontation unfolding before them. "Major Peterson," the colonel's voice carried across the silent formation with deadly precision, "you will release Captain Mitchell immediately, and you will step back from this podium." The command was delivered with such force that even Peterson's rage-fueled determination wavered for a moment. But Peterson's grip on Sarah's arm remained firm, his face twisted with the kind of hatred that had consumed his rational thought. "I will not be silenced by political correctness," he snarled, his voice carrying a desperate edge that suggested a man who had reached the point of no return. "This woman has no business receiving awards that should go to real soldiers." Colonel Harrison's response was unlike anything the assembled troops had ever witnessed. Instead of the expected disciplinary action or physical intervention, he reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope that bore official military markings. The sight of the envelope seemed to drain some of the color from his face, as if he was reluctant to reveal its contents but had been forced to do so by Peterson's actions. "Major Peterson," the colonel said, his voice now carrying a weight that made every soldier in the formation lean forward to hear his words, "you have made accusations about Captain Mitchell's qualifications and service record. Perhaps it is time that everyone present understood exactly who they are looking at." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she watched Colonel Harrison break the seal on the envelope. Throughout her career, there had been aspects of her service that remained classified, operations that could never be discussed in public forums, and recognitions that existed only in the most secure files of military intelligence. She had assumed that her public record, impressive as it was, represented the full extent of what would be acknowledged at today's ceremony. The colonel's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the documents contained within the envelope. "The woman you are assaulting, Major Peterson, the officer whose character you have chosen to attack in front of this entire formation, holds a security clearance that is above your level of authorization." His words began to cut through Peterson's anger like cold water on a flame. Peterson's grip on Sarah's arm loosened slightly as confusion began to replace some of his rage. Security clearances in the military were serious business, and the implications of the colonel's words were beginning to penetrate even his inflamed consciousness. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier venom. Colonel Harrison continued reading from the documents, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. "Captain Mitchell has been involved in joint operations with the CIA, NSA, and military intelligence units that operate at levels of classification that require approval from the Joint Chiefs of Staff themselves." The words fell like hammer blows on the assembled formation, each one adding weight to a picture that none of them had previously imagined. The soldiers in formation began to murmur among themselves, their understanding of the situation shifting dramatically as new information emerged. Sarah Mitchell, the woman they had known as a competent and respected officer, was apparently far more than any of them had realized. The classified nature of her true service record meant that even her fellow officers had been working with incomplete information about her qualifications and achievements. "The operations she has led have saved not just American lives, but have prevented terrorist attacks that could have killed thousands of civilians," Colonel Harrison continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority. "The intelligence she has gathered has been briefed directly to the Pentagon and has influenced strategic decisions at the highest levels of our government." Peterson's face began to pale as the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. The woman he had been attacking was not just a fellow officer, but someone whose service operated at levels far above his own clearance. His accusations of unearned promotion and political favoritism were being systematically destroyed by revelations that placed Sarah's achievements in an entirely different context. But Colonel Harrison was not finished. He pulled out another document from the envelope, this one bearing seals and signatures that indicated its extreme sensitivity. "Captain Mitchell has been recommended for promotion to full colonel by the Army Chief of Staff himself, based on service records that include successful completion of missions that cannot be detailed in any public forum." The words hit the formation like a thunderclap. promotion to full colonel represented a level of achievement that few officers ever reached, and the fact that such a promotion had been recommended by the Army's highest-ranking officer carried implications that reverberated through every soldier present. Sarah herself seemed stunned by this revelation, suggesting that she had not been informed of this development. Major Peterson's grip on Sarah's arm finally released completely as the full weight of his mistake began to crush down upon him. He had not just attacked a fellow officer, he had physically assaulted someone who operated at levels of the military hierarchy that made his own position seem insignificant by comparison. The consequences of his actions were beginning to dawn on him with terrifying clarity. Furthermore, Colonel Harrison continued, his voice now carrying a tone of barely controlled anger, Captain Mitchell has been selected for assignment to a joint task force that reports directly to the Secretary of Defense. Her work in that capacity will involve coordination with international allies and oversight of operations that are vital to national security. The revelation continued to unfold like layers of an onion being peeled away, each new piece of information adding to a picture that none of the assembled soldiers could have imagined. The woman standing before them, who had endured Peterson's attack with such dignity, was apparently one of the most highly regarded officers in the entire military structure. Sarah's mind reeled as she listened to these revelations about her own career trajectory. Much of what Colonel Harrison was revealing had been kept from her for security reasons, and she was learning about her own future assignments at the same time as everyone else. The classified nature of military operations meant that officers often served without full knowledge of how their individual contributions fit into larger strategic pictures. The documents in Colonel Harrison's hands seemed to contain even more surprises. The Distinguished Service Cross that we gathered here today to present is actually the second highest decoration that Captain Mitchell will receive this year, he announced, his words causing another wave of shocked murmurs through the formation. She has also been selected to receive the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, an honor typically reserved for officers of flag rank. Major Peterson stood frozen in place, his face now completely drained of color as the full magnitude of his error became undeniable. The Defense Distinguished Service Medal was one of the highest honors the military could bestow, typically awarded only to generals and admirals for service at the very highest levels of military command. For a captain to receive such recognition was almost unprecedented and indicated achievements far beyond anything Peterson had imagined possible. The assembled soldiers began to see their fellow officer in an entirely new light. Sarah Mitchell was not just a competent captain who had earned respect through solid service, she was apparently one of the most accomplished officers of her generation, with achievements that reached into the most sensitive areas of national security. The fact that such information had been kept classified spoke to the serious nature of her contributions to military operations. Colonel Harrison's voice carried a new edge of authority as he continued his revelations. The missions that Captain Mitchell has led have been studied at the War College as examples of innovative leadership under extreme conditions. Her tactical innovations have been incorporated into training programs for special operations forces, and her strategic thinking has influenced doctrine at the highest levels of military planning. The transformation in the crowd's perception was palpable. What had begun as a ceremony to honor a respected officer had evolved into something much more significant. The soldiers were beginning to understand that they were in the presence of someone whose contributions to military service operated at levels far beyond their previous understanding. Peterson's earlier accusations about political correctness and unearned advancement now seemed not just wrong, but absurdly so. The evidence being presented painted a picture of an officer whose qualifications were so exceptional that they had to be kept classified for national security reasons. His attack on her character and competence had revealed his own ignorance rather than any deficiency in Sarah's service record. But Colonel Harrison had saved his most shocking revelation for last. As he reached the final document in the envelope, his expression became even more grave. "There is one more thing that everyone present needs to understand about Captain Mitchell," he said, his words carrying a finality that suggested the most important information was yet to come. Colonel Harrison's hands trembled as he held the final document from the classified envelope, his eyes scanning the text one more time before revealing information that would fundamentally alter everything the assembled soldiers thought they knew about military hierarchy and chain of command. The silence on the parade ground was so complete that the sound of paper rustling seemed to echo across the formation. "Major Peterson," the colonel said, his voice carrying a weight that made every person present lean forward to catch his words, the officer you have just physically assaulted, the woman whose character you have attacked in front of this entire formation, holds a commission that supersedes every rank currently present on this parade ground." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, their meaning not immediately clear to the assembled troops. Peterson's face showed confusion rather than understanding, as if the colonel's statement existed in a language he couldn't quite comprehend. But Colonel Harrison was not finished with his revelations. "Captain Mitchell," he continued, his voice now carrying an almost reverent tone, "has been serving undercover rank for the past 3 years as part of a classified military intelligence operation. Her actual rank, known only to a select few individuals with the highest security clearances, is Brigadier General." The impact of these words on the formation was immediate and devastating. Hundreds of soldiers who had been watching what they thought was an attack on a fellow captain suddenly realized they had been witnessing an assault on a general officer. The chain of command that governed every aspect of military life had just been turned upside down in the most dramatic fashion possible. Major Peterson's face went through a series of transformations that would have been comical in any other circumstance. Confusion gave way to disbelief, disbelief to horror, and horror to the kind of absolute terror that comes from realizing that one has made an error so catastrophic that it defies comprehension. He had not just attacked a fellow officer, he had physically assaulted a general. Sarah herself seemed stunned by this revelation. Her mouth opened slightly as she processed the information that her cover had been blown in the most public way possible. The classified operation that had required her to maintain her captain's rank for operational security had just been compromised in front of hundreds of witnesses, and she could only imagine the security implications of such exposure. Colonel Harrison continued reading from the document, each word adding another layer to the extraordinary story unfolding before them. "Brigadier General Mitchell has been operating under assumed rank as part of Operation Silent Shield, a joint military intelligence program designed to identify and neutralize threats to military installations from within our own ranks." The implications of this statement sent shockwaves through the assembled formation. The operation that Sarah had been conducting was not just about external threats, but about identifying security risks within the military itself. The fact that she had been operating undercover for 3 years suggested a level of dedication and sacrifice that went far beyond normal military service. She had been living a false identity, accepting lesser recognition and dealing with the kinds of discrimination that Peterson had just demonstrated, all in service to a mission that none of them had known existed. "The investigation that General Mitchell has been conducting has identified several security breaches and has prevented what could have been catastrophic intelligence compromises," Colonel Harrison continued, his words painting a picture of service that operated in shadows and silence, with achievements that could never be publicly recognized or celebrated. Major Peterson began to sway on his feet as the full magnitude of his situation became clear. Under military law, physical assault on a superior officer was a serious crime, but assault on a general officer carried penalties that could include decades in military prison. His career was not just over, his freedom was now in jeopardy because of actions taken in a moment of blind rage and prejudice. The soldiers in formation began to process the information they had just received, and their reactions varied from shock to anger to amazement. Many of them had served alongside Sarah during various operations, never knowing that they were taking orders from someone who held one of the highest ranks in the military hierarchy. The deception had been so complete that even experienced officers had been fooled. Sergeant Williams, who had earlier spoken out in Sarah's defense, stepped forward from his position in the formation. Military protocol had already been shattered by the day's events, and he seemed to feel that the extraordinary circumstances called for extraordinary actions. "General Mitchell, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying across the parade ground, "it has been an honor to serve under your command, regardless of what rank you were wearing." His words seemed to break a spell that had held the formation in silence. Other soldiers who had served with Sarah began to step forward, their actions expressing a level of respect and loyalty that transcended normal military hierarchy. These were troops who had witnessed her leadership firsthand, and the revelation of her true rank only confirmed what they had always suspected about her exceptional qualifications. Colonel Harrison raised his hand to restore order to the formation, but his expression showed understanding rather than anger at the breach of protocol. "General Mitchell's cover has now been compromised by today's events," he announced, "which means that Operation Silent Shield has been concluded ahead of schedule." The investigation she has been conducting has been successfully completed, and her findings will be presented to the Pentagon within the week. Sarah finally found her voice, though it carried a slight tremor that revealed the emotional impact of the day's events. "Thank you, Colonel Harrison, for your discretion in handling this situation," she said, her words carrying the authority that her true rank commanded. "And thank you to all the soldiers who have served with dedication and integrity during my time among you." The transformation in how the assembled troops viewed Sarah was complete and immediate. The woman they had known as a competent captain was revealed to be one of the youngest generals in military history, someone whose achievements had been so sensitive that they required years of classified service under false identity. The respect in their eyes was now tinged with awe at the sacrifice such service had required. Major Peterson remained frozen in place, his career and freedom hanging in the balance as he faced the consequences of his actions. The physical assault on a general officer was not just a violation of military discipline, it was a federal crime that would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of military and civilian law. His prejudice and anger had led him to destroy everything he had worked for throughout his 20-year career. General Mitchell stepped toward Peterson, her movement causing him to flinch as if expecting further retribution. But, instead of anger, her expression showed something closer to pity. "Major Peterson," she said in a voice that carried the full weight of her authority, "your actions today have demonstrated exactly why operations like Silent Shield are necessary. Prejudice and hatred have no place in our military, and officers who cannot see past their own biases become security risks to everyone who serves." The words carried a finality that seemed to seal Peterson's fate. His assault on General Mitchell had not just been an attack on an individual officer, it had been an attack on the principles that the military was supposed to embody. The investigation that she had been conducting had undoubtedly identified him as exactly the kind of security risk that her operation had been designed to expose and eliminate. Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the tension as he prepared to conclude the ceremony that had taken such an unexpected turn. "General Mitchell," he said, his tone now reflecting her true rank, "it is my honor to present you with the Distinguished Service Cross, though I suspect it is only the first of many recognitions that your service has earned." As the medal was finally pinned to Sarah's uniform, the assembled soldiers stood in perfect silence, their understanding of military service fundamentally changed by what they had witnessed. They had seen courage under fire in its purest form, not just in combat against foreign enemies, but in the daily battle against prejudice and discrimination that some soldiers faced from their own comrades. The ceremony concluded with General Mitchell receiving the respect and recognition that her rank commanded, while Major Peterson was quietly escorted away by military police to face the consequences of his actions. The investigation that Sarah had been conducting was complete, having identified security risks and demonstrated the reality of discrimination that still existed within military ranks. As the formation dispersed, soldiers carried with them a new understanding of leadership, sacrifice, and the courage required to serve with honor in the face of adversity. General Sarah Mitchell had proven that true military excellence transcends gender, politics, or personal prejudice, and that the highest ideals of military service are embodied not by those who tear others down, but by those who rise above hatred to serve with distinction and grace. The ceremony that had begun as a simple awards presentation had become a defining moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come, a demonstration that courage comes in many forms and that true honor belongs to those who serve with integrity regardless of the obstacles they face.